The pre-dawn hours of Sunday, December 7th, 1941 were dark and quiet. At 3:30 a.m., Japanese submarines lurking near the entrance to Oahu's Pearl Harbor released 5 midget submarines. Their orders? To penetrate the harbor and assist in the upcoming attack. On patrol near the entrance to the harbor, alert crew members on a small minesweeper, the USS Condor, spotted a periscope. Knowing that U.S. submarines were forbidden to enter these waters, they sent out an alarm. Others joined in the search, but no submarine could be found. 230 miles north of Oahu, the 6 aircraft carriers in the Japanese Carrier Strike Force turned into the wind and began launching their first wave of attack planes. This wave of 183 planes included 40 torpedo bombers, 49 high-altitude bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighter planes. Once airborne, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the attack force, organized the planes into formation for the 90-minute flight to Oahu. The objective of this first wave was to destroy the firepower of the American Pacific Fleet. The battleships anchored south of Ford Island along Battleship Row. At the same time, this attack was also to hit all air bases on Oahu in order to maintain air superiority over the island. By eliminating the U.S. Air Forces, the Japanese attack planes would be protected and retaliatory strikes against the Carrier Strike Force would be prevented. The American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, 200 miles west of Oahu, was returning to Pearl Harbor from a supply mission to Wake Island. As part of its normal operating procedures, it launched 18 planes to scout the route ahead into the harbor. At the entrance to Pearl Harbor, an unidentified submarine was again encountered. The destroyer USS Ward fired on and sank the sub. This sinking was the first action that took place that day in the defense of Pearl Harbor. In 1941, radar was an emerging technology and was in the process of becoming a component of the military's early warning system. The U.S. Army maintained 5 mobile radar stations on Oahu, including the Opana radar station, located on the northern tip of the island. At 7:02 a.m., Opana picked up a strong signal that was interpreted as a large flight of incoming planes at a distance of 137 miles north of Oahu. A message quickly phoned into the information center received little attention. The newly assigned officer in the information center knew that a flight of American B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from Northern California early that morning, and that the Enterprise may have scout planes in the air. Sensing the radar was detecting friendly planes, no action was taken by the officer. The second wave of 167 attack planes launched from the Carrier Strike Force. The air was filled with 78 dive bombers, 54 high-altitude bombers, and 35 fighters. 350 Japanese planes were now in the air, headed toward the island of Oahu. Commander Fuchida, in the lead plane of the attack force, could now see the northern shores of Oahu. As he started the formation down the western coast of the island, there was absolutely no opposition, and he deployed the first wave of attack planes. The dive bombers and fighters, called Zeros by the Allies, separated from the formation and flew down the central portion of Oahu, through the broad saddle between the Waianae Range and the Ka'olau Range. Their mission was to destroy seaplanes and fighter planes at Wheeler and Hickam Fields, Ford Island, and Kaneohe Naval Air Station, and Ewa Marine Air Station. The torpedo bombers and the high-altitude bombers continued down the western side of Oahu, to attack battleships and cruisers within Pearl Harbor. The first bombs of the attack actually fell on Wheeler Field and Kaneohe Naval Air Station. Dive bombers hit the hangars, and Zero fighters strafed American planes on the runways. This job was made easier for the Zeros because, in response to concerns about sabotage, the Army and Navy had lined its planes up, wingtip to wingtip, in neat rows. Planes parked in tight formations were considered easier to guard. The Zeros simply fired incendiary bullets into the rows of planes, setting them on fire. After striking Wheeler Field, Japanese attack planes also hit targets of opportunity at the Army's nearby Schofield Barracks. From his position with the high-altitude bombers, Fuchida could see that their attack on Pearl Harbor was going to be successful. He radioed back to the Japanese carrier strike force the code words for achieving a complete surprise: Tora, Tora, Tora. Many civilians, soldiers, and sailors saw or heard planes approaching Pearl Harbor that morning and paid them no attention. As part of an effort to make the Pacific Fleet battle-ready, mock air raids had been conducted frequently. So, when at 7:55 a.m. a dive bomber swooped down on the Naval Air Station at Ford Island and dropped the first bomb of the Pearl Harbor attack, most observers thought it was just another drill. Even as more explosions rocked the harbor, those not directly involved simply commented, "The Army must be using live ammunition." Those involved in the action, however, were quick to see the red ball, the rising sun insignia of Imperial Japan on the planes, and knew they were under attack. An uncoded radio message was immediately transmitted. "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill." The attack was sudden and terrifying. Continued strikes by dive bombers and fighter planes succeeded in destroying Ford Island's 26 seaplanes, the eyes and ears of the Pacific Fleet. Simultaneously with these strikes, low-flying torpedo bombers entered Pearl Harbor from the north and south. The USS Oklahoma took 6 hits and capsized. The USS West Virginia, struck by at least 5 torpedoes, was sunk. This photo, taken by the Japanese, shows huge oil plumes coming from these 2 torpedoed battleships. The USS Utah on the northern side of Ford Island took 3 hits and capsized, while the USS California was sunk by 2 torpedoes. To illustrate the power of these 1,700-pound torpedoes, 2 ships were docked side by side during the strike: the light cruiser USS Helena and a smaller mine layer, the USS Oglala. A torpedo passed under the smaller Oglala and struck the Helena. Even though the smaller ship was untouched, the pressure wave generated from the torpedo explosion was so great that it ruptured the Oglala's hull and sank it. Within seconds of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese dive bombers and Zero fighters struck Hickam Field and Eva Marine Air Station. Again, the dive bombers targeted hangars, and the fighters strafed and destroyed rows of American planes on the runways. The coordinated attack on Battleship Row continued minutes later with the release of bombs from the high-altitude bombers. These exploding bombs started huge fires on board the ships, which quickly ignited floating oil on the harbor from the ruptured battleships. Battleship Row was a blazing inferno, engulfing everything within its reach, other ships and sailors attempting to swim to safety. 4 armor-piercing bombs hit the USS Arizona, one penetrating the ship and exploding 3 decks below. This detonation ignited 100 tons of black powder in the interior of the ship. The resulting explosion broke the battleship in half and sent a column of fire and red smoke 1,000 feet in the air. Within 8 minutes of the first bomb strike, the Arizona lay on the floor of Pearl Harbor. 1,177 officers, sailors, and Marines went down with the Arizona that Sunday morning, making this attack the worst single disaster in U.S. naval history. In the middle of this ferocious attack, the 11 American B-17 bombers from California arrived at Oahu. They were scheduled to land at Hickam Field, but as they approached the airfield, they became additional targets for the Zeros. 3 crash-landed at Hickam. Others sought alternative landing sites, one setting down on the Kahuku Golf Course in northern Oahu. The 18 scout planes from the USS Enterprise also arrived at Pearl Harbor at this time. 5 were shot down by Japanese fighter planes, and a 6th was lost to U.S. anti-aircraft fire, one of several tragic friendly fire incidents to occur that day. By the time the Japanese second wave reached Oahu, the attack was no longer a surprise. This formation of planes flew down the eastern coast of the island before separating into small groups to strike Pearl Harbor from the south and from the north. This wave would have a little different strategy. This time, the high-altitude bombers would strike the airfields, and the dive bombers would hit the ships in Pearl Harbor. The success of the first wave actually made this mission a bit more difficult and more dangerous for the Japanese. The black, thick smoke rising from the crippled battleships along Battleship Row made targets harder to find, and American forces were now responding with anti-aircraft fire. This wave would lose 20 aircraft to American resistance, compared to only 9 losses in the first wave. During a slight lull in the fighting between the 2 attack waves, the USS Nevada, despite suffering torpedo damage, started to pull away from Battleship Row. It was making a run for the entrance to Pearl Harbor and the open ocean. A cheer went up from the sailors fighting fires on the many stricken ships. The cheers were cut short when the dive bombers of the second wave saw the Nevada moving and swooped down to stop her. The ship took at least 5 direct hits. To avoid the possibility of being sunk in the channel and blocking the entire harbor, she was purposely run aground at Hospital Point. The dive bombers then turned their attention to other ships in the harbor. In Dry Dock Number 1, they found and struck the battleship USS Pennsylvania and the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs. Bombs ignited fires on the destroyers. The fires detonated onboard depth charges and torpedoes, sinking both ships. In Floating Dry Dock Number 2, dive bombers concentrated on the destroyer USS Shaw. These bomb strikes eventually ignited gunpowder in the ship's forward magazines. The resulting explosion rocked Pearl Harbor and sent a fireball into the air that was visible for miles. At Hickam Field and Kaneohe Naval Air Station, high-level bombers destroyed hangars and surface facilities. Zeros also strafed the runways, targeting airplanes and anything else that moved. 3 American fighter planes tried to get into the air from Bellows Field. 8 Zeros swept over the runway and shot down all 3 planes. However, at Wheeler Field, 6 P-36 fighters did get airborne and broke up an approaching air raid. By 10 o'clock a.m., the Japanese assault was over. The attacking planes had all retreated to their carriers, leaving in their wake an incredible swath of carnage. 21 of the 185 vessels in Pearl Harbor had been sunk or seriously damaged. 188 airplanes had been destroyed and another 159 damaged on Oahu's 6 airfields. But more significantly, 2,390 had lost their lives in the attacks, and another 1,178 were wounded. Nearly half of this death toll was accounted for by the sinking of the Arizona. These casualties also included civilians. Some were working at Pearl Harbor. The majority were from the downtown Honolulu area. A shower of unexploded anti-aircraft shells fell to earth. Many detonated on impact, causing property damage, injuries, and most of the 49 civilian fatalities that day. With the departure of the second wave, American forces had time to regroup and brace for what might come next. It wasn't long before rumors started flying. The Japanese had landed troops on the North Shore as the first of an invasion force and were moving overland. False reports of water supplies being poisoned and of enemy paratroopers were coming in from all parts of Oahu. Needless to say, everyone was on edge. This edginess led directly to a final friendly fire incident. That afternoon, the Enterprise's scout planes, bombers, and fighters were in the air, looking for the Japanese carriers. All planes returned to the Enterprise that evening, except 6 F-4F fighter planes that went on to land at Ford Island. The control tower had advised all ships that American planes were incoming, but once the planes were spotted, the entire harbor began shooting. 4 of the F-4F fighters were shot down, killing 3 American pilots. By this time, the Japanese carrier strike force was 500 miles northwest of Oahu, on a course for home, having, in a 2-hour time span, introduced to the United States and the world the era of the aircraft carrier and its pivotal role in modern warfare.